So the lights go down, so I think that is a right moment to start. So I hope everybody will come in and we can start. So I was just looking around before the lights actually went down, and it's good to see that still so many people are around. I think we all had a nice evening before. Some had a nice dinner, some went out, and I think this is something we were all very waiting for, that we have this kind of interaction. But now today, we will talk again science and policy. And to be quite frank, when I was thinking about this plenary yesterday, I got a little bit nervous. I was thinking, well, these plenaries which we had yesterday and the day before yesterday were really excellent. I think the one which was led by Ulrich Rutter, and there was a lot of debate and a lot of energy going on. And the one which was yesterday, which was, I think, excellent in terms of content, but also very funny. So I felt, well, again, we have to raise the bar today. And hopefully we can do at least as good, or maybe even better, than the ones which we had before. So I'm very happy to have this kind of plenary, because the topic, I think, is very timely. And it's called Running Around Circles, and time for real collaboration between regulators, HTAi bodies, and clinicians. I will do a few slides for introduction. So when we were actually discussing this plenary, suddenly this paper came out. And I think this paper is very instrumental in terms of what kind of debate we are going to have today. So this was really about the ecosystem of health decision-making, from fragmentation to synergy. And I think it showed that actually everybody thinks that we have to do something over there. We have to come together and see how we can actually collaborate and what is needed to do so. And if you look to the authors already in this paper, there are many also from these different groups. There are clinicians over there, there are regulators, there are HTAi bodies. I think there's one person from my organization, but also I think from the Canadian organization and from NICE. So it already shows that there was already there a lot of commitment to see what can we actually do. And if you look to the main conclusions of this paper, they really make sense. So you say, well, there are many actors, such as regulators, HTAi bodies, clinicians, involved in making decisions at various levels that really affect access to health technologies. And although the criteria and methods used by those may differ, there's also a lot of overlap, and they exist also together. And then they had this discussion, which was actually chaired by WHO, where they said, well, what can we do? What can we actually do to bring those together? And what kind of opportunities are there to collaborate in the future? So they said, well, there's decision-making activities. They have to respond to system needs. But quite often they are poorly coordinated, nationally as well as globally. And therefore, those decisions which are made in isolation might actually lead to misleading, unnecessary conflicts to the health system, and therefore lead to confusion, for instance, for the patients. So this is just the work we did, because I'm also personally involved in a project with what can we do if you have this process. And I think we're talking about more complex therapies, where we have market approval, where we have HTAi reimbursement, updating in the clinical guidelines. Can we actually bring them more closely together? We still, of course, have to acknowledge that there are different remits. But I think there are a lot of opportunities to actually do so. And there are already some studies, some science, which shows that it's possible to, for instance, have alignment and actually decrease timing between regulators and HTAi. For instance, on the left-hand side, there's the study which was done by a colleague from EMA on, if you look at the early dialogues and you compare the kind of advices which come from HTAi and from regulators, you see already a lot of overlap. For instance, if you look at the population. But there are still also some differences, which are understandable. For instance, if you look at differences on which comparators to use if you do a study. And then at the right hand of this slide, there is a kind of overview of what happens if a drug actually comes to market, and what are the kind of delays. Here you still see a lot of fragmentation. But there are also countries, like for instance Australia, where this process is already very well aligned. So you know what is going to happen after market authorization. It will just take 125 days before there is subsequently the recommendation on this health technology. So, and then we did also some work on multiple sclerosis. So if you look at HTAi advices, if you look at clinical guidelines in Europe, we said, well, how do they compare actually? And what you, for instance, see that it's very different in countries. In some HTAi reports in some countries, they refer quite commonly to these clinical lights, but in some others they don't. And also, there's a lot of question on what is the uncertainty and the different perception of the uncertainty. And if you look, for instance, is there any clinical consultation? Well, less than 50% of the HTAi reports. Is there a formal cooperation with the clinicians? Less than 20%. So it shows that over there might be more opportunities to collaborate. And if you go to the other side, to the clinical guidelines, do they actually do something with the HTAi reports? Sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But again, I think there is not that much interaction. There might be some reference to reports or to the pharmacoeconomic studies, but there is nearly no formal cooperation with HTAi organizations. And if you now, for instance, look to the guidelines, how long does it actually take before new drugs or new advices are actually taken up? Well, there are probably 3 treatments behind, and it will take 2.5 years on average before these new treatments actually get into the guidelines. So these are just a few examples, and if we will hear more examples today, and we will discuss what we can do about these examples. So what kind of topics are we going to address today? So what are the types of evidence which we use, and how is this actually being perceived by regulators, HTAi bodies and clinicians over the life cycle of the health technologies? Because this is the theme of the conference, so also there over the whole life cycle, we want to foster this kind of interaction between the stakeholders. What are the experiences in terms of interaction between regulators, HTAi bodies and clinicians, and how could these be implemented for different types of health technologies such as medical devices and pharmaceuticals? And how do actually other stakeholders, like innovators and patients, perceive that interaction? And what do you think, what's in for them? Do they want that kind of more interaction, or they say, no, they have different remits, we don't want that interaction? But for me, I think that's the end of my introduction, because I'm very happy that I have a very experienced moderator from Spain, Laura San Pietro, and I think people which are in the HTAi space know her for quite a while. I think she's one of the most experienced HTAi people I know, and sometimes I still feel quite young in terms of HTAi experience if I compare myself to Laura. So I'm very happy that she's going to moderate this, and I give the floor to her.
Too stressful. Too stressful for you.
Please, Laura, come over.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Wim, for this introductory words. So this plenary is based under the hypothesis that a closer collaboration between different stakeholders along the lifetime cycle of development of technologies is going to bring to market innovations of high value. And Wim has shown that in this collaboration, there are some things that are already aligned, some are overlap, and other things that still needs to be more work on. But this panel is aimed to qualitatively, if I may say, test if this hypothesis could be true or not. And for that, today we have different representatives here as a panelist. We have representing clinicians, Dr. Alan Fraser. He's a consultant cardiologist at the University of Wales and coordinator of the project CORE MD, that means Coordinating Research and Evidence for High-Risk Medical Devices. Thank you, Alan, for being here. Then we have Dr. Dana Harakova. She's a neurologist from the Center for Clinical Neuroscience in the Czech Republic. Thank you very much, Dana, for being here. How come we also have a representative here from the patients, also, that is Yvette Jacob. Yvette is belonging to the European Patients Academy, EUPATI, and past president of the European Patient Forum for Youth Group in Hungary. Thank you, Yvette, for being here. So in my right side, We have Christine Muthel. She's representing here the innovators. And she is the lead market access and reimbursement in international markets at Philips company. Then we have representatives from the regulatory side, and we have Javier Guzmán. Javier, well, I would say that Javier has two hats. He's here as a regulator, but he has a lot of experience also in HTAi because he was the vice director in the Colombian HTAi agency some time ago. So you hear we're in the regulator side, but it's great that you have the other hat too. So Javier is working at the Global Health Policy Center. Actually, is the director of Global Health Policy Center for Global Development in USA. And he is quite representing developing countries here. He has a lot of experience in this area. Then we have Michael Bunken. Michael Bunken, he also represents the regulator, and he's the head of scientific evidence generation at EMA, and his department aims to support the development of robust evidence in collaboration with other stakeholders. And finally, my friend Steve Pearson, because we know from long time ago, and I think it's very well known in the HTAi society. Steve Pearson is representing HTAi bodies, and he's the president of the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, ICER, at USA, and he's working there with a lot of policymakers in United States. Okay, so how we are going to run this session? First of all, we will have two presentations, one from our clinicians, Alan Fraser, and then from Michael Bunken as a regulator. And after that, we will open a discussion between the members of this panel. But you, all the participants or attendants here, you can just ask your questions here in the app, and Wim is here to help me just to raise in any question that can be introduced in the dialogue. And before we start with the presentation, we have a poll that is fashionable in this meeting, this poll. So if you can open your app, we have two questions for all of you. Let's see. So the first question is, let's see if it's working now. Amren, can you just, okay, thank you very much. So the first question is, have you experienced a collaboration between regulators, HTAi bodies, and clinicians? Yes, directly, yes, indirectly, or no? If you can answer.
We don't need to. I don't know.
Let's see the results. Amren? Oh, there is okay. Oh, almost tied, 33%, 30%, 33% yes directly, 30% yes indirectly, and 37% no. So we have quite people that have experienced more or less this type of interaction. Let's go for the second question. Please, Amrim, the second question. Okay. What type of interaction do you think is more valuable to easy innovation access into healthcare system? HTAi regulators, clinicians, and patients, HTAi regulators and clinicians, HTAi regulators and patients, HTAi regulations, or no interaction?
Trick question. I have to see this.
So the results are, let's see, chan, chan, chan. Music, please, music, chan. Do you have it? I don't have it here. Well, 81% all should interact, 9% just HTAi regulators and clinicians, 2% HTAi regulators and patients, 4% HTAi and regulation, and 3% no interaction. I would like to hear about these 3% people during the discussion. It would be very interesting. Okay, thank you very much. So let's start with a discussion, and maybe I will move to Christine, the innovators. So I think that as an innovator, you are one of the person that are more eager to have this interaction, so you can bring valuable and innovative products into the market. But I'm wondering from your experience, because I'm sure that you or your colleagues have some experience in this collaboration, what do you think industry or inventors, because sometimes there are SMEs or startups, no? What do you think you can bring into these collaborations with regulators and HTAi, but also what these interactions bring to you? So in the both sides, what regulators and HTAi collaboration bring to the company, but also what you bring to them.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, thank you. First of all, let me comment that I represent the medical technology innovators. Very important because health technologies are very diverse and different, and even in the medical technology bucket, you have so many differences. So for us, evidence is, of course, an inherent part of the entire process. So from ideation to R&D, product development, regulatory approval, market access, that is patient access and adoption, so that you can actually speak not only of a process, but rather an infinite value loop of where we need to generate and think of evidence, so patient evidence as well as clinical evidence, economic evidence. At the same time, and this is the challenge for innovators, so whether you are a startup, SME, or industry, we are also faced with the challenge of finite healthcare budgets, so and the regulatory requirements. And I also want to separate the two because regulatory requirements, this is a very set framework, so you know exactly which boxes to tick for being safe and effective, whereas at the same time, the bodies concerned with market access and adoption are asking the question, is it useful and is it necessary? And this is, of course, for innovators, not a nice question because, of course, it's useful and it's necessary because we want to make the world better. It might sound a bit cheeky, however, because we also know it's not a free market environment, the healthcare market. It's a closed, regulated market. And this is also the challenge for, fired up, and we have all gone through the COVID and still going through the COVID period, where a lot of innovations have been really pushed forward, where there is also the awareness that, yes, innovation can make a difference. Yes, of course, also, by the way, it had also changed a bit, or actually a lot from regulators as well as the advisory bodies to accelerate, for example, the early dialogue programs, then the guidance frameworks, as well as conditional access with or coverage with evidence requirements. And also, healthcare startup boot camps where regulators as well as market HTAi experts are, really dealing and also advising innovators and industry, also the big corporate ones, because we depend on collaboration. However, still the challenge is that, the current assessment of evidence is really focused on a single product and in the current healthcare system structures. Whereas when you look at medical technology, specifically everything in the realm of digital, we are also disrupting actually or transforming pathways. We also have elements in the value proposition that are currently not really adequately addressed, like, for example, when we instigate task shifting, improve our staff satisfaction. This is not in the current evidence requirements. So again, we learn from these programs, and again, all over Europe, whether it's NICE, GBA, HTAi, the Scandinavian, if I'm allowed to summarize them under Scandinavian HTAi bodies. And at the same time, we would also like to discuss and enter into cooperation with these expert bodies in how to assess these so-called transformative innovations. So like, for example, the Next Gen HTAi program, because you're looking at integrated solutions where you have a convergence of pharma, of diagnostics, of invasive treatments, and as well as the importance of data. And moving not only per healthcare episode, but you're moving actually across an entire patient or care pathway. and also, with all the systemic structures that are required.
Thank you very much, Christine. As you can see, we are innovating because we had to start with the presentations and we started with the discussion. But anyway, let's move to the presentations. We take this. This is innovation. It's a real life thing. So let's move to the presentations. First, Alan, could you present your...
Thank you, Laura, and thank you to you and your colleagues for the invitation to take part. I've been involved as a clinical cardiologist in regulatory science and advocacy, if you like, within Europe for about 10 years. And I've been asked in this presentation to show some clinical examples to set the context of these discussions. But let me start by saying when I first got involved in meetings in Brussels, I found probably an effective regulatory environment, but it was very much a partnership between regulators and manufacturers. There were almost no clinicians involved in setting standards or discussing the process, which to me was very surprising. So and that actually extends also to the production of standards, because as you know, Europe for devices relies on standards from the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission, most of whose members are either regulators or from the R&D departments of companies. So actually what we need, and you can take this as my main slide, is an evidence-based, not an effective, but an evidence-based regulatory environment based on scientific evidence, and that's been a theme of this meeting. I don't think anyone would disagree. But that leads to the inescapable conclusion that at every step, expert scientists, engineers, clinicians, pharmacologists, basic scientists, whoever they are, depending on whether it's for drugs or devices, need to be around the table. And I still find myself reminding people at meetings to think of the basic evidence generators from clinical and basic research and the patients whom I've included here. And we do that now with the Biomedical Alliance, which is the symbol at the bottom left, with the regulators, I think fairly effectively, both for the European Medicines Agency and for the European device regulators. My particular involvement has been with devices, so I'm going to show 3 quick examples which I think support my contentions, which are on the first slides. And these all come from heart valve disease, which we know is an area of very active innovation. There are perhaps 100 different percutaneous valve devices being developed currently, few of which are on the market, but many are being developed. So there are also criticisms, as you may have heard recently, about the higher standards set by the medical device regulation in Europe as to whether or not it is attainable or achievable or necessary. And I would argue that it is, and let me show you the reasons why we believe we need more clinical evidence before approval. This is for devices. I would extend it after the last session in this room also to pharma. We need to maintain the requirement for proper randomized controlled trials before approval with clinical endpoints rather than surrogate endpoints. This is the study that got myself involved and my colleague Eric Butchart, cardiac surgeon, involved in regulatory science, trying to understand how this could happen. And like many clinicians before this experience, we had no concept of regulatory approval of devices and assumed that anything that we were given would be effective and safe and proven to be working. And on the left, you see the St. Jude valve, the standard valve, but the sewing ring is impregnated with silver, which is why it's glistening gray, and that was designed to prevent infection because silver has an antibacterial effect. But on the right, you see one of these valves explanted from one of our patients, and it caused fatal, in some cases, thrombosis of the valve with embolism and paraprosthetic regurgitation and other complications, which we reported. We happened to be doing a study, or we wouldn't have identified this risk. There was also a randomized trial done in the States, both of which are listed on this slide. But this was a device that had been approved as an iterative change on the basis of equivalence. So there was no clinical evidence, there was no trial. And as an example of why we need the new higher standards with clinical effectiveness, here is the requirement in the new regulation that equivalence cannot be used now without quite tight conditions, and I've put in italics the requirement to have the same materials in contact with the human tissues. So that valve that I've just shown you would not have been approved on the basis of equivalence under the new regulations. My second example is just illustrating the need for transparency. And again, many other colleagues have mentioned that in the context of HTAi decisions, just as in regulatory approval decisions. But I think that we have a problem with the procedures of notified bodies and the company submissions to notified bodies for device approval in Europe not being in the public domain, and we don't know what's happening. And let me show you an example of that. These are transesophageal echocardiographic images of a patient of mine whom you will see we studied quite a few years ago now. She has an aortic valve replacement, which is what you see there. And on the right, you might just see some material attached to the occluder of the valve. Difficult to see if you don't have experience looking at these. But this was at a time when her international normalized ratio, the test for the adequacy of her anticoagulation, was low at 1.9. Normally, we would recommend higher levels for people with mechanical heart valves. But that was just after the company had announced in press releases and on the web that it had CE marking approval for this valve to be used with an INR below 2. So apparently she was within the acceptable range, which to us was very unusual because we'd never seen this with a similar valve before. So we wanted to understand how it could be that this had been recommended. So we looked at the valve in its packaging. We found the CE mark and the number of the notified body, which we looked up on the NANDO database. It was the French laboratory, National Laboratory of Testing, GMED in Paris. And we're not allowed to contact a notified body for any information, and they're not allowed to tell us anything, which is wrong clinically on ethical grounds, I think. So what we did is contact the UK agency, MHRA. They could contact the French agency, which was responsible for designating that notified body. They contacted the notified body. Apparently, they said there was no problem, and they told ANSM, who then told MHRA, and the answer we got was, we've looked at it, there's no problem. So we got no information, and we still have a clinical problem. And in fact, the next year, a study was published in the USA showing that this was only possible under very strict conditions, and I think I won't go through all of these, but my patient had fulfilled none of these requirements, which were part of the trial that had led to the CE mark, but that was not in the public domain. And indeed, the risk of these events under those conditions at 4.7 per year was actually higher than the upper limit of the acceptable international standard in ISO guidance, but it had still been approved. And that was an example that we reported in this subsequent paper on the need for transparency. And I think if we're talking about science-based decisions from a clinical perspective and from the perspective of patients, it's essential that all the information is in the public domain. We expect that for drugs. It should be exactly the same for devices. And my third example is the need to have and develop global standards which don't vary between different jurisdictions and which are transparently developed with open membership consultation periods for the public and not just the national regulatory or standards institutes and for academic experts. And here's an example of another heart valve for the tricuspid valve, a percutaneous device, where again the first notice was a press release that this has been CE marked. And they state in the data from that at that time that the results that supported this CE mark were going to be presented at the EuroPCR conference. And it does state and note that it wasn't approved in the USA where the standards were different. And there are ethical issues also, which I'd be happy to discuss about different standards in different parts of the world. But I therefore looked at the database and the slides from that meeting, and this is the evidence. And you can perhaps see the numbers of patients in these different endpoints. down to 14 for the echocardiographic surrogate marker on the left-hand end of this slide. The results from the 6-minute walk test, which is slightly more objective, available in only 16 of these patients, but notice the expanded scale of the y-axis, which makes the results look much more significant than they really were. Now, the point of this was that when I looked at this, it appeared that this had been approved on the basis of cumulative experience of only 11 patient years in total, whereas the ISO standard says you need to have 800 patient years of experience for a new heart valve. You can draw your own conclusions. There were also a lot of complications. In fact, only 33% of the patients had no event. Sorry, that's the other way around. 77 had no event. So 23% of patients had complications, some of them including death. Now, we know from this, I think, important study, which was the first analysis of approval systems compared in Europe with the USA from 2016. If you look on the left-hand side, the blue bars show the time interval when devices were approved earlier in Europe than in North America. So there was a difference, we're aware of that. But on the right, you see that this earlier approval was actually associated with there being less evidence and with a 3-fold increased risk cumulatively of device recalls or alerts. So European patients were getting devices earlier, but with less evidence and more risk. So we do need higher standards of clinical evidence in Europe. And I also find it strange that international regulatory jurisdictions are now competing with each other to be the most innovative, to be the most supportive of new technology, which is driven by industry and by financial concerns and by the interests of the clinicians developing these devices, but not, I think, in the interests of patients, because I think the standards should be shared. And here is just one analysis of the start of the breakthrough program by the HTAi, which you may be familiar with, showing a very marked increase in applications, but on the right demonstrating that these are now also associated with less evidence, fewer pivotal randomized controlled trials and more risk, and I won't go through all the points that are listed there in detail. These authors concluded that the FDA should be collaborating with colleagues internationally, and I think we should be doing that as academics and clinicians and patients, as well as with regulators. This should be a joint initiative. So let me conclude with a couple of slides on what I see as priorities. And you may be aware of this interesting paper from a few years ago now that set out requirements for regulatory integrity, not just for science, good practice, or ethical research practice, but commenting that there was a tendency to over-rely on small or short trials, on surrogate markers, which we heard again earlier this morning, misapplication of expedited pathways, which I've just referred to, inadequate post-market requirements, we see that increasing, fortunately, and insufficient regulatory oversight or enforcement. And I don't want to criticize anyone, because I also observe the difficulty in finding enough experts to do these processes for HTAi, for regulation, for companies, for everybody. And so that's why we should be sharing these decisions. My perspective, and this is again more focused on devices than drugs, what we need or what's missing within Europe is firstly proper transparency, and unfortunately with the new medical device regulation, the database EUDAMED is not necessarily going to give us access to everything. We need more open access specific guidance rather than international standardization organization standards, for which you can only get access if you pay for them, even each individual clinician. We want more early dialogue. Again, that's been shared in this meeting. I think a lot of the evidence requirements for HTAi and regulatory approval are similar. I think we need more shared systems, also sharing risk for orphan devices. And I would like to see conditional approval schemes being tightened, both being made more available, but also more tight control afterwards, so that devices or drugs really are taken off the market if the requirements are not met. And we could do this at the bottom using more pragmatic trials and with publicly supported post-market surveillance. And Laura, you mentioned at the start this project that we're involved in, CoreMD, which is a request by the European Commission to a large group to help to develop methodological approaches for high-risk medical devices. And what's unusual about this is that it includes universities and academic bodies together with patients and regulators, public health authorities, notified bodies, and the Commission. So it's the kind of process working together that we need in all these fields, which has not yet really been well established. And just to give you some idea of the kinds of things we're doing within that project, looking at how to support innovation with early access studies, how to capitalize on advances in trial methodology, including the trials unit in Oxford that has been so prominent with COVID, and the group in Uppsala that started registry-based randomized trials. We have a project, like everybody else, looking at artificial intelligence, devices in children, real-world post-market data, and looking at the use of patient-reported outcomes. And if any of you are interested in that, we have published the protocol for our study, and we have a website that you'd be welcome to visit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. Thank you. Thank you, Alan, to showing us some evidentiary weaknesses that still we have with medical devices, and also some lack of transparency, some lack of international collaboration to meet the standards. But thank you to give some hints on how to overcome also all this. So we are taking notes of that. And now it's your turn, and Michael. So he will bring us the regulatory perspective, and he will show us how a collaboration can be achieved, and we have some good examples on that. And maybe you can answer some of the challenges Alan just put to you.
Sure. Thanks, first of all, to the organizers for having me here, for inviting me to this panel. It's really a true pleasure being here. In this very diverse panel, I should say, because we cover so many disciplines, but also so many areas of medical device and pharma. But also to speak to this audience, because coming as a medicines regulator, this is an audience where we don't often talk to enough, I should even say. So having the opportunity to talk to HTAi bodies, talking to academia, talking to also industry folks for market access maybe, is very valuable, and therefore really, really grateful to be here today. I'm also saying this because within EMA, I'm coordinating our engagement with HTAs and payers, and therefore this discussion we're having here is really to be seen in this context, and also my presentation today. But I should also say, maybe from the outset, to manage expectations, I'm now looking at the pharma side, and whilst I recognize many of the challenges that Alan has presented, I will not be able to address all of them, although it would be lovely to describe them and to see how it is in the pharma world. And I think there can be a lot of benefit from mutual exchange between these worlds, like between regulators and HTAs. And again, that's back to the beauty of this panel here today. Now, without further ado, just a brief disclaimer here to say what this presentation is all about, but then a quick outline of what I would like to go through. First of all, really the different remits and collective aims we believe we have. Then the experience in interaction between regulators and HTA bodies in particular. Technical cooperation to build trust. And I think building trust is really, really a key principle in these discussions. I will focus very briefly on medicines that address unmet medical needs. I will make a tangent towards Darwin EU, an opportunity for enhanced cooperation, and we'll finish with looking ahead in terms of the collaboration under the new HTA regulation, and all of this in 20 minutes. So please stay with me in these discussions. I will focus, of course, on the European perspective, and in many areas I will focus on the regulatory HTA interface, recognizing, however, also the areas of working with clinicians and patients alike. Now, setting the scene, I think this is really a theme which, at least in the sessions which I also heard this morning, goes through. It's the synergy through discussion of evidence generation plan. It's really the understanding that we may have to take decisions with different objectives. And it's going to be clear here when it comes to medicines. The medicines regulator is looking after the benefit-risk profile of an individual product. And the HTAi colleagues, they are contextualizing this and the use of the medicine in the healthcare system context. But the hypothesis is that we, through alignment of thinking, cross-decision makers should facilitate eventually access, because the focus on patient access is really what this should be all about. So we should come together and discuss very early what are the key elements in terms of development, like comparator, design of the trial population endpoints, but also the requirements for post-licensing or post-launch evidence generation, PLEG as an acronym, which I will come back to later again. And the expectation here is to have optimized evidence generation plan throughout the life cycle, which meets the different needs of the various decision makers, because there's an understanding that there is a sequence of different remits, but that decisions are building on each other. And that's what we really see as the bottom line here. Let me make a very brief example with a case study here for brolucizumab for wet age-related macular degeneration. And I give you here nuggets, I should say, of the assessment by regulators and by HTAi later, HTAi on the European context, and then later national decision-making. And you can see here that the CHMP, which is the licensing committee at European level at EMA, came to the conclusion that the benefit risk is positive, that there has been evidence of efficacy in comparison with the comparator used in the trial. The European HTAi assessment then went further in terms of the comparator needs and identified the difference with another compound which is not known, and this led eventually the German HTAi body to conclude that an additional benefit of the product is not yet proven with the comparators in the context relevant for the healthcare setting. Now, all of these decisions, I would say, make sense in themselves, because you look at them and they are done within their remits. And yet I can imagine it will be very challenging to explain to other stakeholders, including clinicians, including patients, how can one say there's a positive benefit risk, but there is no additional benefit? How does this all come together? And I think this is, for me, an example really where we need to discuss along the decision-making chain with the various key players here, key elements such as comparator to be used in evidence generation plans so that we can facilitate the later discussions. And of course, in here, and that comes partly already to Alan's point, the involvement with clinician, with academia and patient organization is key, and that we've seen throughout our experience. There is an underlying principle, and this is that there should be value of cooperation. And in this very simplistic circle here, we have a decision to be taken, we do some planning, we do implementation, evidence generation, information, knowledge, and then we come back to the decision based on this. And it is a circle, and we need to engage all of us, the different constituencies in this circle. For example, when it comes to guidance on new developments, let me give you the example of evidence transfer. In the regulatory world, we call it extrapolation. Always we need to translate even the terminology sometimes. Evidence transfer, how can you make a transfer from the evidence for one population to another? What are the boundaries, limitations, but also opportunities in here? Let me take new endpoints in drug development, and I heard this morning in the session a lot about surrogate endpoints, and also Ellen made the reference to it. But a common understanding of the limitations, opportunities, and challenges with different types of endpoints, I think it's very important to discuss together. And then learnings from decision-making. looking at the various degrees of uncertainties, because there's always uncertainty in decision-making. But what is the degree of uncertainty and how can we address uncertainty subsequently should be supported through this discussion across the cycle which is presented here. Now, from a European perspective at the HTAi regulatory interface, we have been working with HTAi bodies since 2010, and I had the pleasure to be involved in the very first meeting, and Wim yourself as well, and I do remember this very first meeting in 2010 we had. And can I say the tension in the room at the time, when the first time European regulators and HTAs, the UNETA project came at the time together, and yeah, really got to know each other, I would say. And if I just review a bit what has happened over these now 12 years, it is fascinating. I had the pleasure to be part of all these bilateral meetings, all these work plans, etc. And we have been working a lot with colleagues. We had 2 work plans already completed. We are having currently the 3rd work plan. I'll give you an idea later what this all entails. It's a lot about building trust. It's a lot about building mutual understanding. It's a lot about really looking at products together, but also methodologies together. And it's also important for us to be transparent towards the stakeholders. Stakeholders are observing our work very, very closely. Patient organizations, clinicians, other decision makers are really looking very carefully at what we're doing here. And I should also say, and I think this is really the highest type of recognition you could get, what has started as a project work at the time is now part of a new European legislation. This interface between HTAs and regulators is embedded in the new HTAi regulation, and I think the good experience we have been making throughout this time is really, really key to this achievement. Let me give you 3 examples where this all matters. The first one is really about the design of evidence generation plans. And here, defining the evidence together is key. This is from a publication which Wim has already presented, and I think it has been presented so many times at HTAi in the meantime. That's why everybody's familiar. And it shows so nicely that, of course, the key component of, let's say, potentially divergent views is around the comparator. Wim also mentioned it earlier. And it's about not just between HTAs and regulators, but also understand between HTAs. There's many reasons for it. But it's important that we come closer together through these discussions. And in fact, we did manage through the discussion to come closer together to allow identifying a single evidence generation plan. The second area of engagement, which I think is very crucial, is when it really matters. When do we come to our decision? From a regulatory outcome, the CHMP opinion as we call it, so the regulatory approval, to a relative effectiveness assessment, what are the exchanges we allow each other? What are the perspectives we are having? And we have tried this under UNETA Joint Action 3. We had 14 products in scope here, where we had direct interactions between the HTAi authors and the regulatory assessors as soon as the regulatory assessment was complete, to really allow HTAs to also ask questions. Why do you think this was appropriate to be included in the label? What's your reasoning in these cases? What uncertainties have you seen? But also to give an advice on what could be future evidence generation plan in order to address remaining uncertainties. And it's extremely important to have this presented therein. You see one example here. In the interest of time, I don't go into the details here, but I think it's very thrilling to see also how then a European public assessment report, which by the way is public, compares to the UNETA relative effectiveness report, which is also public. And therefore one can see the similarities and also how they've been addressed. So there is a lot which we have in common, where we can then progressively work together along the decision-making chain. This has been valued also by those actors deeply involved. And I'm just sharing this little nugget here from an internal review we did with the HTAi authors and the regulatory CHMP rapporteurs involved in these webinars. And throughout, they were always saying these direct interactions, which were really, really new at the time at European level, have really helped us to build understanding, trust, get relevant information, and also, and I think this is a very important element in here, allow us to have a first discussion on post-licensing evidence. And I'll come to this again in my next example, which is my focus area number 3, looking at methodologies. Post-licensing evidence is something that becomes more and more important. You see here a publication which HTAs, regulators, and industry, by the way, have done together in this space. And it's really the understanding that there's a continuum of evidence generation. Yes, you have to make a decision, but then there will be more evidence coming in. You need to design collectively this evidence so that it's going to be useful for updates, for example, of label later. And this is something so crucial, which we really would like to advocate for, again, HTAs and regulators together. Now, there were many other highlights which we have delivered under the last work plan to 2021. And I think these significant developments are really good to see. And I guess colleagues will also get slides or access to them. There's many hyperlinks if colleagues would like to get more, because the chair is pressing me now, rightly so, I should say. We have also done a very recent review by a master student at the Maastricht University here. And this was to give a very comprehensive review where we are at this HTAi regulatory interface in pharma, I should say very clearly here, based on literature, EPA and RIA, but also on interviews. And good recommendations have come out here in order to foster this collaboration further. Now, some notes about addressing unmet medical need, and I heard this already referred to earlier, the priority medicine scheme. So let me just briefly say this scheme is really focusing on medicines that address unmet medical need. It is a support scheme for the developer to get the evidence right. It is not in itself a scheme to alter the evidence requirements. I think that's an important nuance, because I heard this sometimes discussed in different ways. We've done recently a review of the 5-year experience. You see here also very clearly what type of products we have in the scheme, a lot of ATMPs, a lot of orphans. We can certainly discuss what the evidence was needed in order to get also them later approved. 18 medicines were approved during this time frame. But I think important to say here, and that comes back to Alan's point, we're having in the pharma side, in the pharma side, we have a lot of points around dual designation of medicine between FDA and EMA, and for those products we discuss very clearly where the evidence needs are. What is sometimes not really matured yet, but it's an opportunity also for these medicines, is to work with HTAs, and there is a review recently done by the colleagues from SEERS on this matter. Conditional marketing authorization, another area where we need to progress further in order to get this also right. And again, maybe I leave this for the discussion if some more questions will come up, because I would like to briefly mention at least Darwin EU, because that's a new opportunity in the real-world evidence space. Darwin EU provides a new way to interrogate and analyze real-world evidence, and this is something which has been set up by the regulatory system initially, EMA together with HMA, but also involves HTAs and payers in the advisory board, and that has been identified very, very early. There's a number of studies which can be conducted under the scheme, and we are going to have a workshop very shortly to agree together with HTAs and payers on the use cases to test the system, which I believe will be very important to have this matured. Now, summing up, we have another work plan which is currently ongoing. It supports the implementation of the new legislation. I hope I've given you a couple of ideas of what we are doing in this space in pharma, and it's progressing, I would say, quite nicely. It also includes in there the notion of engagement with HCPs and patients in terms of methodologies, but also types of endpoints. So again, this comes back to earlier discussions. It is a perspective in terms of the early interaction between regulators and HTAs that it really requires effort and willingness to take forward, but it's really the focus on the benefit that a patient ultimately have to receive these treatments, and it's therefore with a focus around access and transparency of information. And again, I need to just confirm this is really, really key. So with these, I leave you with these take-home messages around the need to create opportunities to discuss together. It is possible. At the HTAi regulatory interface, we made, I would say, quite some good progress, which we then also see cascaded under the future HTAi regulation. And with this, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michael, for showing us that collaboration is here, is going ahead, and still there are a lot of space to do more things. So, but from the poll we have had just at the beginning, I've seen that most of you agree that the collaboration should be with all the stakeholders from the scratch, so since the beginning. But it seems to me, Alam and I don't remember, Dr. Haroka, it seems to me that until now, it seems that in these conversations at the HTAi regulatory level, clinicians has not been present there. He has been present in other areas of discussions, no? But not when regulators as HTAs are discussing. Why do, especially in medical device arena, why do you think this is happening, and what do you think, what principles should govern a good relationship with them?
I'm not sure that I completely understand why we have different attitudes in medicine to evidence requirements for devices against drugs. And I wonder if it goes back centuries to the division between barber surgeons and physicians, and that we expect the tools that we have to work without actually questioning them. But having said that, at least in the UK, NICE has medical technology panels, and at least 2 of my colleagues in Cardiff are very active in those. So this is changing, but we have different expectations as clinicians. We expect a new drug to be available with a randomized controlled trial, and until recently, many people didn't understand that the standards for devices in Europe were safety and performance, but not effectiveness. And so we need to educate ourselves, and we need more people to become involved in regulatory science as a normal progression of what we do with clinical research. After all, many of us develop methods or tools that we don't see implemented because we haven't gone the next stage to interact with regulators in HTAi.
Dana?
If I can comment, unfortunately, I don't have so much experience with medical devices. My field is multiple sclerosis, which is chronic disease, chronic disabling disease that without treatment ends up badly. And to be honest, I'm coming from the Czech Republic where even the access to the drug is even more restricted compared to the Western countries. So we really, for many years, have we needed to fight for reimbursement for our patients. And my experience, but probably it's a more general experience, without data, without hard data, nobody hurts you. So we as a community 10 years ago started to collect or to build Czech National Registry. We succeeded. Right now, in 2022, we have almost 90% coverage of the all Czech MS patients in the registry, and we have the data. We don't know just how many patients, but we have all the information about them. What's the disability? What's the employment status? What are the outcomes, pregnancy rate, particular drugs? And after having this data, the regulators started to talk to us. Before that, we were invisible to them, to be honest, yeah. I really can say that with this hard data, we have achieved much, much more than just talking. And one comment, it's a question now, who should collect the data? Because it's not primarily our task as a clinician, yeah, but it was we were desperate because nobody talked to us and we were not allowed to treat the patients, yeah. So it's a question who should collect the data, and from the other side, if we want evidence, of course, physicians has to be involved, patients have to be involved, and I always, my experience that a lot of people talks about registries, about the data, but there are not many people who really mean it properly. So talk to the right people, because if you from the first minute hear, it's impossible, there are these barriers, this is data protection and so on, this is not the right person. You have to find the right person to collect data.
Yeah. So who should, yeah? Good reactions here. So who should collect the data and who should pay for that? And what standards should have the collection of data? On my right side, any answer? Michael?
Nobody wants.
No, nobody wants to answer. So this is a tricky thing.
No, is it working? Yes. Sure, happy to come in here. I just didn't want to occupy too much space. But very briefly, I fully agree with you on the points of registry data. And it's really then from a European perspective that we are trying to facilitate these discussions also across different registries which need to connect. And we have had, for example, registries workshop. We had registry initiatives previously launched in the areas of cystic fibrosis, for example, where we have connected then and allowed the discussion with academia, with clinicians, patients, but also HTAi payers in these to really come together to a single platform which can then inform, particularly for rare diseases, that these registries are meaningful. We have even a program to qualify registries on this basis, and we have done so in some occasions. And this is really something where we are going to progress. And in fact, on this occasion, I can say there will be a workshop on qualification later this year, which will certainly also touch base on these elements.
Yeah. I think
very important.
Yeah, no. And I think, as you know, to make good, high-quality registers is not easy to design and to maintain. It's very expensive, so I think it's necessary at least to have some standards on how to collect and what. Yeah,
I may add, this is, for example, one of these areas where everyone has to collaborate.
Yeah.
Industry, because we also heard now about because the medical device or health technology industry is so complex. Patients, clinicians, also in order to make it credible and also know what standards should be applied, what data should be collected. And again, I really like your example of really knowing also, the non-typical data that is being collected. For example, also addressing that this patient group is very diverse with regards to age and employment status. So also the socioeconomic data is relevant for a healthcare system to make decisions.
Yeah. And I think, Yvette, that you have some examples of good collaboration in collecting data, no, especially this, not the standard data, maybe other type of data that are very relevant to patients that maybe clinical registers or more scientific registers don't capture.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I have to start with a quick disclaimer that my views are my own as a trained patient expert. And yes, collecting data. So when preparing for this panel, I looked into the reports of regulatory authorities on the effect of patient engagement, and I found really good data. So I thought I would share that with you. So it's been no stranger to regulatory authorities to involve patients. And for example, the FDA has a guidance on collecting patient experience data. And currently, they also include patient experience data tables in more than 80% of their reviews, which reflect how important these data are. And I really do think that patients and patient organizations have a real value and a role in collecting this data and pointing out which are the patient-relevant data points to collect, which are the milestones in the patient journey where not all patients will want the same, where we have to take into account patient experiences and patient preferences and really collect this complementary evidence that helps to see the big picture. And to be very honest, when I was invited to the panel and looked at the title, I was a bit bummed not to see patients listed there, but I'm really positively motivated to convince you by the end of this conversation that we bring a real value to the table, and not just because we should be involved, but because we give value to the collaboration, yes.
Yeah. And thank you very much, Yvette, and for sure, at the HTAi community, we are convinced that patients as clinicians should be there from the scratch collaborating, so no doubt for that. But one of the things I'm wondering when we were preparing this panel is that, okay, we need to collect better data, we need to collaborate, but the world of technologies is rising exponentially. There are so many technologies, so many products there. Should we do that for all type of technologies, of type of product, or maybe we can just target specific type of products to make these big efforts of collaboration, of making registers and so on. Steve, do you have some thought about that?
Yes, you're right. There's no way that, I mean, part of the issue around collaboration from the HTAi perspective, and by the way, I know I work with one HTAi organization. I'm supposed to represent the view of many, and I'm not immune to the irony that I, from the United States, am here and commenting on this when we have almost we have the least collaboration between the payer and HTAi community and regulators across any of the jurisdictions at the table here. But the question of bandwidth, as good as an idea as collaboration sounds, HTAs are always facing their own trade-offs between time and resources. So your point is well taken. And who will decide which of these different types of technologies, which individual drugs, which types of technologies would benefit most from this kind of collaboration, I think is a very important element. And it's possible that the regulators, again, you would probably need a collaborative process to figure out the answer to that question because the perspectives are likely to be different, where the need for collaboration is felt more by regulators, for instance, than from HTAi or payers and health systems.
Yeah. This is a challenge that maybe, yes, Javier, go ahead.
Oh, just wanted to take a step back because I understand, we're talking here from a high-income country perspective, and we see very mature systems. So we see regulators being around for a very long time. We've seen, HTA agencies being created and, for many years. But if you look at the world, if you look at middle-income countries, if you look at low-income countries, that is not the case. And I do think that there is a window of opportunity to reimagine the way these structures are built, are created. It's interesting to see how we talk about how we align and how we decide on responsibilities between two parallel structures. And we could have the same approach in terms of building capacity in low and middle income countries. For instance, WHO in 2018 said only 30% of countries have a functional regulatory authority, so only 30% of countries. And they did an assessment of HTA agencies last year, and about 50% of countries have some legislative framework to have decision-making processes. Not to say that they do in HTA. So when you get to, and this is a real-life example, we got to Costa Rica, and the minister is saying, should I create a regulatory agency? Should I create a HTA agency? How do I build capacity in a context where there's no money, no human resources? And if you get down to the bottom of it, the mandates are different in high-income countries, but that's a historic decision. I mean, that doesn't need to be repeated now. So I would argue that there is a case to be made for the capacity to be built in those countries together. And together because we have a very common scope in terms of what methodologies there are. We've got human resources, similar human resources. We've got a lot to learn from the two different universes. Regulators don't think much about engaging patients and clinicians until recently, whereas HTA agencies started with that in their DNA. So I do think that the process could actually be more efficient, but also more effective. And I understand a lot of people are not really into that conversation because it's a change of paradigm, but that doesn't need to be the same decision. It could be different decisions within the same body using, this life cycle approach.
Sure, thank you very much for bringing the perspective of developing countries, but this is quite an intimate collaboration, being so close. So I don't know what do the others react to this, what do they think, because this can have pros and cons, no? And I would like to know the thoughts of the other panelists. So Alan, please.
I'd like to support what Javier was just saying, but to point out a problem, which is that at the top international level of collaboration, both for pharma and devices, scientists are not really involved. The International Council on Harmonization, which produces the good clinical practice guidelines, is officially, when you look at their website, a collaboration between regulators and industry. And the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, which produces GCP guidance documents and so on as well, only recognizes global bodies as stakeholders, and there is no single body of medical scientists or associations that can be recognized, whereas the companies have made global trade associations that they do recognize. They're sort of superstructure organizations just for the purpose of being there at the table. But I think there is a challenge for these groups and for ISO to work out how transparently they can integrate and involve experts. And then we have the problem of identifying which expert represents the world medical community for multiple sclerosis or something, which is a whole new challenge. But they need to be there. Someone needs to be there. I think you'd agree with that. And I fully support the idea of global regulatory convergence, if possible, to make it easy for those countries that don't have established systems not to have to reinvent everything that's already being done and find people who don't exist to help them with their evaluations.
Yeah, so I can see here like two tiers of collaboration. One that you are advocating more at global, international, that maybe some systems can take over, but I think, and correct me, that still these countries need to have something more at the local level, and you were proposing for this jointly almost intimate collaboration, no? But I really would like to know what do you think about that, because there are pros and cons from the regulatory and HTAi side. Yeah.
So I actually agree with you completely that if we were starting over, a lot of countries would just build one process, because the skill set, most of the questions, I mean, it's almost like we're working with the old parts and trying to figure out how to weld them together effectively, whereas we could have started together. On the other hand, there's an old kind of philosophical difference, and you laid it out well, between the purpose of a regulator and an HTAi group. And in I guess, a higher income setting, there's always the feeling that the government might not agree to pay for it, but individuals should, as long as it's safe and effective. And that divide continues to create a reason why regulators should keep on a hat that maybe doesn't talk about cost every day, whereas HTAi does. And that is always still at the root of some of the questions around how we bolt the parts together, because over time, everybody's going to say, obviously not every disagreement is a problem, and you laid this out too. There are reasons sometimes that you would expect a regulator to say yes and an HTAi to say no. So that's not the problem. The problem is when there's the opportunity missed of aligning the evidence generation process, when the opportunity is missed to time it so that you don't have them sequentially, but you could do them at least in parallel. And the opportunity is missed to get patients and others involved at an earlier stage. So those are all the good reasons. And I know in England, with their innovative licensing and access pathway, they're doing the same kind of trying to bolt the pieces together to get these parts to talk to each other. But in the US, one perspective again, if you want to take the contrarian view, there are concerns because people just don't know what's going to happen in the room when you're bonding, when you go out for a beer after work. Is it going to be the HTAi people telling you, oh, there's too much uncertainty, say no? Is it going to be the regulators who've been talking to pharma saying, oh, just get over your uncertainty problem, there's a huge unmet need, we should be saying yes? Who wins? Who loses? And everybody asks that question. Patients ask that question, pharmaceutical companies and device companies ask that question, and in different countries, the answer may be different about who influences whom, who wins. But that being said, it's just so hard to imagine that this isn't the right way to go, and to figure it out mistakes might be made, but we have to figure out how to bring them together, which is a very long-winded way to say that I agree with him.
No, just wanted to say, you know, things are changing so much, especially the kind of data that you're going through. So before, and I'm talking about middle-income countries, I come from Colombia. So when we created the HTAi agency, you know, the data the HTAi agency used to go through was data on effectiveness, really, because the product had been in the market for 10, 15 years. So the data set the regulator had seen was very different to the data set the HTAi agency would see. But now the expectation is that you bring that review much earlier in the process, which basically you are, in time frame, you are actually looking at data at the marketing authorization point, which basically ends up with the similar data, almost equal data. So I do take the point that, you know, different mandates, and it doesn't need to be the same decision, maybe, but it could be the same, you know, decision, because when we talk about the next frontier, regulators started with safety. They didn't care about efficacy. Then 30 years later, they got started into efficacy. So why don't we say that now we're talking about value? And I see how that is not easy because it requires a total different mindset. But we're talking about countries where, you know, the law is being drafted. So the African Union just drafted, you know, the medicines law. Countries are looking into this issue at the moment. So I think there's a way to rethink how we do things.
Michael, and then we have a question here.
Yeah, no, thanks. This is such an exciting discussion. Really great. And I think if we have one thing in common, then this is that we're all working under capacity constraints. Mm-hmm. That's normally the case. So it is that we always need to look at two things. The first one being prioritization, and that's to your first question, Laura. You asked initially, so should we just teach everything equally, or do we need to prioritize? I personally believe you need to prioritize. And the prioritization criterion for me is, where does it matter for patient? What's the medicine that really makes a difference for patient? Where's the unmet need being addressed, et cetera, et cetera? And again, in the interest of time, not going through all the details, but I think that should be the starting point for any prioritization work. And from that perspective, we can work then in order to identify where are these commonalities. The second area, which I think we need to work on much, much more, is also methodologies, guidances, for example, on what development programs are needed. And I'm saying this from a variety of perspectives, including, again, clinicians need to involve in development programs, patients need to get involved, and developers themselves, they need to run a certain number of programs themselves. So the more we have a perspective on how development programs should look like to answer different questions within remits, and I think that's an important point, the more we help the entire healthcare system. So for me, it is a healthcare system approach to be taken in its collective way. And yes, there's a question about remits sometimes, there's a question that we need to consider. I think, and I fully agree with you, it's a long way to go. It's a long way to go, but I think it is possible. I personally am so motivated also by what I had the pleasure to witness over the past 10 years. And another key area is transparency. Be transparent about how you come to an outcome, be transparent about your reasoning, so let also the others, including other stakeholders, understand how you come to this conclusion. That's really, really key to build this trust.
Yeah, I think this question is from the audience, and I think it reflects maybe an idea how we could move forward. And the question is, should clinical guidelines and protocols be an output of a more structured collaboration between clinicians, HTA bodies, and regulators, rather than a product performed by only one of those entities? Anybody who wants to respond to that?
You want to
Dana?
start?
Yeah.
I will start with this. I completely understand your frustration because I'm also coming from the middle-income countries. I will answer the question later. But what I want to say that my view is I've been sitting for many years around one table with the people from Scandinavia, Switzerland, Australia, much richer countries. And they didn't care about the price of the drugs. They just, the drug entered the market and they are allowed to prescribe the drug. It's completely different in our countries, yeah? And we have just two options. We can either complain or we can start to do something because nobody will help us. It's great that we can use examples from abroad, but we have to start in our countries to start to collect data because my experience over 30 years, it's if you are convinced that your patients need these drugs, and for example, multiple sclerosis, I'm really convinced it's not preventable, young people and so on, they have all evidence they should receive the drug and they should receive it early, then you should have the hard data and then you should fight because there is nobody wise at the Ministry of Health who would say this deserve and this not. It's about about prioritization. It's about you have to fight for it. You have organized people around you. It's one point. Regarding the guidelines, it's very important, but it takes time. It requires very educated people to write guidelines. In my field, for example, we can use the European guidelines and we can use them. They are not always reflected by our regulators. We have to fight, but it's getting better and better. 10 years, they didn't reflect guidelines at all. It was only the money. But it's getting better, yeah. But my experience is really you have to have hard data and to fight for it. It's nobody will give you anything for free. It's my experience.
Thank you, Dan. And I think that what you and also Javier brought about is to say, okay, look at different contexts, different countries, values are different, the organization of healthcare is different, the power forces are different, so probably it could be countries that doing this parallel review or collaboration is not as successful or is not as perceived as successful by different stakeholders. And I think in the United States there were this case that in the parallel review, so it was not as successful as.
Right. Well, let me briefly also comment on her. I think guidelines obviously are very different in different countries. They happen at different points in time. But I am definitely struck, we're talking about collaboration, and I know that HTAi usually thinks, that's me working with the regulator. But in a lot of ways, it's working with clinicians in the health system and payers, and the payer may not be the health system. So you have to figure out, because the payer might be the one, an independent payer in our country, who's deciding whether to do a value-based outcomes agreement to handle some of the elements of uncertainty. But the health system represents the physicians who are going to be delivering the drug in centers of excellence. And HTAi really has to understand that whole worldview and bring them in, and the patients too. So guidelines, though, I think really are critical at the time of launch. That's when, regulators say yes, let's say HTAi says yes, but they have to say yes in a way that frames how will it be used by clinicians and the health system. And far too often that just doesn't happen. The drugs just kind of, if we're talking about drugs at least, they're just kind of released, and then it's up to the marketing arm of the pharmaceutical industry. And sometimes the clinical specialty societies will catch up 2 years later. Yeah. So I think there's an area where if we talked about, again, aligning timing as well as other interactions, clinical specialty societies should get in the room and get up front of how some of these new, many of them should be introduced. So that's a statement. Briefly,
Just later, because Alan and probably Dana would like to comment on that.
I'd like to comment just briefly on the same question of guidelines. Coming from cardiology, where we have huge numbers of guidelines, I would be critical of many of them, and there have been publications that have done this, because it's fine when they do systematic reviews and report evidence, but they go beyond that often when there isn't sufficient evidence to make consensus recommendations. It's not always clear which is which, and so we need to tighten up our methodology. I was also interested that Wim, in one of his first slides, put guidelines after HTAi. Now, to me, they come before HTAi because they're different processes. The clinical practice guidelines are summarizing, I hope, what's effective. And HTAi is what's comparatively better than the other options or what's cost effective, in my opinion. It's about value. And our job as clinicians in clinical practice guidelines is to summarize what exists that's effective for that disease. Doesn't necessarily mean that it has to be supported or paid. So there is an area for overlap and dialogue between HTAi and clinical practice guidelines, but only for the first part of that process, which is what is the basic evidence. And that should be the same, and I completely agree it should be done together. But where it's even more important, I think, that we do have this dialogue between academia and HTAi and regulators is in advising on clinical trial methodologies and generation of evidence right at the start of the process.
Thank you, Alan. Dana, do you want to add?
Regarding the guidelines and appraisal process, the guidelines usually summarize the medical science, what we know from the basic science clinical trials, but I think in this process is also important what is the impact not only in the healthcare system but also in the social system. And there is quite a gap between the healthcare price and social price. So I think this should be also appreciated in this process, and it's several times it's not taken into account. It's my experience.
Thank you. So Steve, why?
Just one example, I guess.
Yes.
This goes back to the question of whether what we're talking about is almost an integrated, collaborative approach to working on these issues versus parallel at the same time. But you can even imagine the manufacturer comes in, has a meeting at noon with the regulator and at 1 p.m. with the HTAi, and the HTAi and the regulators never see each other. But it's done, and for reasons I won't spend time getting into, that's kind of the way it was set up in the US back in 2011, and this was for medical devices only, because our nation, again, loves being out of step, and so we don't negotiate around drugs, don't have a national HTAi there, but our Medicare program does look at the evidence on devices procedures. So they set it up in a pilot program. They thought it was going to be a big win. They thought it was going to accelerate. They thought it was going to align, and it basically just went nowhere. One company stepped up to be a guinea pig, and their phase 3 flopped, so it never really got through either process. After 8 years, I think they've done 2, and they were both tests. And the general feeling, and this is from consultants, not me in particular, because I haven't really been that close to this process, but why wasn't it a success? I mean, why weren't people knocking on the door to get this done, to get things at least parallel in time? And in our unique situation, again, it was because they were afraid that getting the national payer involved, you can think just HTAi, would be less amenable to innovation than the company being able to market to individual payers and not having a national HTAi program involved at all. So they were afraid that the influence and the decision-making brought to a national level would be more likely to be a no than they would get if they did it through usual kind of procedures. So again, that's just a very uniquely dysfunctional kind of situation in the US, but it speaks to the ongoing question of this parallel versus really integrated, and whose mindset is influencing whom at what stage. We all cannot disagree on the idea that being together to decide how we think about certain outcomes, certain opportunities for post-marketing surveillance, methodology is not one where too many people feel like there's a huge risk. But around the actual decision of yes, no, I think people are still nervous.
I think that, Michael, do you want to comment? Or?
Very briefly.
Briefly, yeah, shortly.
Very
because
to say, fully agree with you in a sense of where you really have to come together around the table is when you design the evidence. When you have that discussion, what evidence should be designed, because there you just hear different perspectives, and the idea should be to come towards a single plan addressing different questions. It's extremely beneficial to hear also the other perspectives in this context. But where you have to be mindful is when it comes to the decision time, where you just need to find the right touch points, that information which is relevant is being passed on. This is where maybe some nervousness comes in, where I think I've shown you some example what we tried so far, and I think where we progress, hopefully also from here, to make this a system which eventually delivers patients.
Mm-hmm. Javier, and do you want to comment something on that?
Just a
Yes, sure.
small word. You know, I understand, and I fully agree with you in terms of deciding upfront what evidence is going to be needed. I think there's a very bad legacy from the regulatory standpoint about, you know, introducing placebo and not comparing with, you know, active comparators. And there are reasons for it. But if you see the big discrepancy in terms of the universe of data, that's going to be the key one. But what I don't understand is how a regulator can approve a medicine against a comparator that is not active, that is placebo, and at the same time, next day, the HTAi agency is saying, you shouldn't have done that. Like, we cannot make decisions on the basis of that data. So I clearly see the need to, you know, focus on that point. Because if you look at the studies, that's sticky point, right?
Okay, I was just looking at the question and answers because we are almost running out of time, and I have a lot of questions. My God, we need 1 hour more. But then there is the hour ceremony is very important. But there is one question here that I agree completely. Those who vote at the beginning, this 3% that vote that no collaboration, that there should not be no collaboration, is there here anybody who wants to elaborate on that? Why they think nobody should collaborate? Which is, okay, it's respectful. Who vote? Oh. No? I cannot see. No? No? Silence?
Impossible to see from here.
Silence? Okay.
They hit the wrong button. Who knows? They might have hit the wrong button.
Yeah.
I'll add on something really quickly to what you said.
Sure.
You're right. I mean, it is kind of easy to say that the evidence generation should be less controversial about who's influencing whom. But that question is central in many ways. Will the evidence kind of advice be you need to do a placebo-controlled trial using a surrogate outcome? Will it be a randomized trial with placebo but a clinical outcome? Will it be a single-arm trial? You know, these options, people will have different opinions about what's needed. And the HTAi group might say, look, the risk of getting this wrong is really high because this is going to be expensive in a lot of people. And the regulator is going to say, that's not my job. I don't worry about that. I worry about unmet need. And there we need to go easier, quicker. And it'll be really interesting to see how those two wheels fit together. But that has to happen. That conversation should happen instead of sequentially, in which the risk of just getting it wrong and the conversation not happening early enough is really high. In my experience, I wish that companies knew more about how to do their FDA requirements in a way that can help HTAi. They can still do a placebo-controlled trial, but if they use the same eligibility criteria, the same outcome measures as an active comparator, just little things like measuring at 6 weeks the outcome like the other trials did and not picking 8 weeks or 9 weeks, which makes HTAi people, you know, go crazy, lose their hair. And so little things like that can start to be something that regulators really can take on board because they say, oh, we don't have to ask for an active comparator trial. We just have to make sure that this line of research can be indirectly compared to that line in a way that HTAi feels comfortable with. That's a huge opportunity that, at least in the US, we are still not seizing. But I think probably in Europe and elsewhere, that's got to be one of the things that you see as a window for success.
Well, a challenging question here that has been voted a lot, so I'm going to ask your panelists. Huh? They say, do the panelists think that regulation of drugs and devices has become more about achieving industrial policy goals and not about protecting patients? A lot of votes.
Impossible to answer in 10 seconds or whatever we have left.
Yeah.
Because this touches on capitalism and the society that we live in. I think about this a lot. We could not practice modern medicine without the tools and the drugs that companies give us, but they need to be more ethical sometimes in the prices that they set for their products. And the influence that they have is disproportionate, from what I've observed, to the influence that should be coming from patients and from clinicians in regulatory circles.
We have been discussing that we need more real-world evidence, which is obvious. And from my point of view, and I believe from patient point of view, it's not only because cost-effectiveness, how the drugs and devices behave in the real world, but it's also because of the safety. And all of us, we know how much the safety, serious adverse events are underreported, and this is the only way when we arrange the safety, effective environment through the, I don't know, registries or through this real-world data, how can be the safety data also collected? So otherwise, right now, it's a really big underreporting of the safety data. So this is the second pillar for me.
Well, I think that we have arrived at the end of the plenary. I still have the poll asking about collaboration, which type of collaboration, but I think that at the beginning, 89% of the people agree, so I don't think that anybody has changed their mind. Or is there anybody who have changed their mind and they think that we don't have to? Yeah, but they, yeah, probably. They were ashamed and they go. Okay, so thank you very much to this wonderful panel of experts representing different points of view. And let me also thank Wim, who has been the co-chair, but also the one who has put together all these panels. So thank you very much, Wim. So, and now, the best part of the meeting, the awards and the party, besides what the party yesterday, that was wonderful.